What is classical economics? Classical economics is the basis for economic thought in which capitalism is concerned. The leading ideas of classical economics are free trade, a free marketplace, and the ability of individuals to pursue their own success at their own risk. It is a school of thought that developed from the writings of economists and philosophers such as Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and John Stuart Mill. Adam Smith is considered to be the father of classical political economy, as it is also known, as he laid out many of the tenets of the school of thought in his work The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. This is why the field of classical economics is also sometimes referred to as Smithian economics. Classical economics seeks to address concepts that show how people could benefit from resources as industrialization began to shape Great Britain and other parts of the world. The economy at the time had shifted from one based on insulated trade and resource hoarding by governments. Classical economics and the works around it sought to explain why a country would benefit from shifting that power from governments to the people. The classical school of thought is still referenced by economists in the 21st century, as many tenets of what classical economists wrote about back in the 1700s and 1800s have been expanded upon by newer schools of thought. Ultimately, their work has remained foundational in how the modern world of economics continues to function. Understanding classical economic theory. Classical economic theory came to prominence in the 18th and 19th centuries as a reaction to mercantilism and other one-sided forms of trade and commerce from the era before. As capitalism started to become more commonplace, it was soon realized that the opportunity for economic freedom that came from more open and unimpeded trade would also be the way in which that freedom also self-regulated. Adam Smith likened this sentiment to that of an invisible hand that drives individuals to produce and contribute to themselves and to the greater good of society. Eventually, classical economics spurred differing opinions from the likes of Karl Marx and John Maynard Keynes. Both of these men saw the effects of laissez-faire governance in the economy, which brought about new schools of thought and led to the fall of classical economics as the standard of economic thought. The free market is a major component of classical economic theory as well as the theory of value. The theory of value is the attempt to place worth on something that will determine the price that someone is willing to pay. In many cases, the cost of labor, the primary resource, is the value that can be derived from something. Ideally, the value of an item and the price one pays should be similar if not identical. If a player in the market is not selling at the fair market price, the desire to look elsewhere for a better price will correct that inequity. Private ownership of businesses, capital, and resources is also a major proponent of classical economics. When individuals have the power to make their own financial choices and determine the use of their resources, this should encourage the economy to move freely and fairly based on the actions of those with self-interest. What is a classical economist? A classical economist is a proponent of the theories of economics that Adam Smith introduced. A handful of economists in the late 18th and early 19th century started to expand upon the ideas that Smith had presented in The Wealth of Nations not long before their time. Classical economists stand for conditions that would empower individuals to be able to define their own economic freedom while also allowing others in the same vein to act as a regulation to their peers. A market free of government regulation, private ownership of all business and resources, value determined by the market and the cost to produce, and merit-based compensation are all tenets of what a classical economist believes. This school of thought is still employed in some advanced variations that have a basis in the classical school of thought but have adjusted to the process of society into the modern day. Examples of classical economists. David Ricardo is one of the most prominent classical economists. A portrait of David Ricardo. When discussing famous classical economists, it is essential to talk about Adam Smith. He was a Scottish philosopher whose work laid the foundations for classical economics as it is understood today. Smith's concepts of division of labor as well as rational self-interest known as the invisible hand have been used as the foundations of capitalism as an economic system. David Ricardo was a British economist who expanded upon Smith's theories on labor and value. He also contributed his own views on the benefits of open trade with other nations rather than trying to remain insulated. John Stuart Mill is often grouped among the important classical economists because his early works on economic thought were in support of free markets and limited government intervention except for certain taxes that would help to regulate things like alcohol or animal welfare. He also had concerns about how industrialization would be spiritually deadening and thus felt that empowering workers with merit-based incentives would help to prevent the repetitive boredom of industrial work.